Welcome to our panel. Thank you for being here. I'm Greg Cappelli. I am the CEO of Apollo Education Group, which is based in Phoenix, Arizona. We own and operate the University of Phoenix, among other domestic education institutions, as well as Apollo Global, which are international educational institutions around the world. And we also do some boot camps through the Iron Yard IT coding schools and things like that. I have spent probably the last 20, 25 years initially researching at Credit Suisse the higher education, actually all of education industry in the US and then abroad. I was lucky to get to work on a number of transactions both here in China, Brazil, India, to really try to get a better, it helped me gain a real appreciation, understanding for how important human capital is. And every time I would talk to a great business leader, wherever it was, here or abroad, I'd always ask them, look, what is the most important thing to your success? And some would say, well, right now we're trying to raise capital for the business. But in most cases, right, there's the availability of financial capital around the world, most times. Sometimes we have disruptions. But by far and away, the ones that were the standout organizations that had the highest returns for the longest period of time always identified human capital as their most precious asset, right? And the one that they would work the hardest to find and retain, right? That would drive their business over a longer period of time for success. So there were a lot of lessons learned there. The industry is developing rapidly. And if you look at the name of the panel, it's, are you investing in the workforce of tomorrow or the workforce of yesterday? And I want to tell you, I've had an opportunity to meet with probably about 100 of the Fortune 500 CEOs or senior management teams. And a very fascinating statistic, and then I want to introduce the panel and have them talk a little bit about their background. But one of the most fascinating things that I learned from the conversations was, this was a listening tour, was companies recruit talent in different ways throughout the organization at all different levels, different ways. Some go to schools and recruit, some use job boards, right? Some is online, some is face-to-face, some use temporary staffing agencies to do it, like the Manpowers of the world, Kelly and others. But what I learned was, and this statistic's becoming more, you see it in print now, about 50% of the time, right, there's billions and billions of dollars spent here and abroad to recruit talent and human capital. About 50% of the time, employers claim that they never get a positive ROI on that process, return on investment. And the reason is because people are recruited and they change jobs 11 or 13 times now in the US, right? So they're recruited into areas that aren't great fits, either for them or the employer. So there's something in that process that's not working as well as it should in the US. Now you bring along the subject of the millennials, right, that we're going to talk about as well, and how different this group of young men and women are coming into the workforce versus 20 years ago. And that's another part of the process, recruiting the right kind of talent, getting into the right places, and making sure they have success and your organization has success for what you need. So we're going to talk a bit about this subject today. And we've got just an amazingly talented panel here. It's a pleasure to be moderating. I'd like to start by introducing Seth Harris. He's counsel at Denton's and former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Labor. So lots of interesting conversations in this area, I know, over the years with the Obama administration. John Donovan, who's the Chief Strategy Officer and Group President at AT&T Technology and Operations. I'll just personally say AT&T has been, from what I've seen, among the leading companies in the U.S. in terms of the innovation that they're putting into this entire process around developing a workforce of the future. And John's a big part of it. Edith Cooper, former competitor at Goldman Sachs. She's the Executive Vice President and Global Head of Human Capital Management at Goldman Sachs. Thank you for being here. To my right, David Bernstein. You can tell where the youth is on the panel here. Yeah. Our young guy here, he's going to talk about the millennials. CEO and co-founder, Run for America, author of Fast Future, How the Millennial Generation is Shaping Our World. So looking forward to hearing your comments on that. And then last but certainly not least, and who will be leaving a few minutes early to go on CNBC, is Jared Bernstein, Economic Policy Fellow at the Milken Institute, and then Senior Fellow for Center on Budget and Policy. And maybe you'll give us a hint of what you're going to be talking about today. But let me welcome the panel. And what I'd like to do is really, the first question I'd like to address, and I'll start down at this end with Seth, is, what are the types of things that you are seeing in terms of shortages, skills shortages, either in business, small or large businesses that you're seeing? I'm going to ask the panel to kind of go through and talk about a little bit, just discuss quickly, what you're seeing and where the gaps are, because we hear this term skills gap so much today.
Yeah, I actually, I'm a skills gap skeptic. I think we hear a lot of talk among businesses about skills gaps, but then if you pry a little bit more deeply and ask them sort of whether they have taken self-evident steps to address their skills challenges, often the answers come up no, no, and no. Have they partnered with a local community college and communicated clearly the sets of competencies that they need so that the community colleges can train workers to fit into those jobs? Have they partnered with veterans organizations where you have already skilled workers who are available to come in and fit into the workplace and are already about as disciplined a group of workers as you're ever going to find? The answer comes back no. Have they broken down their job descriptions into sets of competencies so that they really know what skills they're looking for, so that they won't be disappointed when they hire somebody and become surprised that just because they happen to be a Kansas Jayhawk, that where they went to school, that the person is not as wonderfully skilled and brilliant as they are? Not picking on
those
Kansas
are fighting words, by the way.
Sorry. Went to Cornell, so not as well known at school, I don't think. I don't think that we know that there is a skills gap. Now, having said that, with the remarkable transformation in technology in our country and the rapid move towards doing virtually everything online, both internally and externally, there are sets of skills that we know folks need to have as a basic matter, and where there are challenges at the basic skills levels. But the biggest challenges are how corporations are making decisions for themselves about who they're hiring rather than the workers who are presenting themselves for those jobs.
Interesting. John, do you agree with that about the skills? Not sure if we have a skills gap or?
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
So if he's a skills gap skeptic, I'll call myself a skills gap immersive. If you look at our company's 140 years old. You look at the pace of technology change. I have very little turnover. I have third generation employees who consider the Bell system in their blood. And all of a sudden you've got declarations of Google into your space, of Amazon into your space. And so all of a sudden the web guys come and they're armed for war. And you look at that, you'd say, okay, well, how many people do I have that need to shift their skills? And you look and do the basic math and say, well, maybe 10,000 are behind the curve. Maybe 50,000 are about to be behind the curve. And in the next 24 months, I have another 20,000. So you do the math. You say
people in the company?
280,000. So I have 80,000 of them that are in an alarm state of need to change. The U.S. system, the community college system, you can't solve that problem. Mathematically, you can't hire your way out of that problem. And so we had to fundamentally rethink what we do with the workforce. And so, we talk about that everybody needs to change, and some of them have to change rapidly. Some of them have a few years. So I do think that the points made, I think, are right on the money. A lot of companies talk about it and don't really define it, measure it, manage it, put plans into action. They mostly bemoan it. But I think it's as real and as alarming for companies of our size, of our age, as any other big pivot that we've seen, whether it's technological, whether it's regulatory or any other dimension.
That's fascinating. I know you're reskilling tens of thousands of people, and I think later we're going to have a slide that you're starting to talk a little bit about some of the ways you're doing that for the group. It's fascinating. Edith, so Goldman Sachs, generally thought of as you're hiring the highest quality, caliber talent out of the top schools, although it goes all the way down into the back office and IT and whatnot. Does even a Goldman Sachs have a skills gap, or is it hard today to get the kind of talent that Goldman's looking for?
Well, we're a different scale, of course, different industry. We have 34,000 people operate in 35 countries around the world. And I don't think we're unique in our desire to find extraordinary people. I would suspect that even in Run for America, which is a new company, you would say the same, 280, I don't know how many people you have. I think the thing that is important for us is to make sure that we're very clear in understanding, as you said, the competencies that we're looking for in someone who would thrive if we have the appropriate environment. We have changed, the demographics of our company have also continued to evolve, where the federation, which is what we call the operations, technology, legal, compliance, and our people functions, have grown increasingly as a significant part of the organization. Long gone are the days of, the back office mentality requiring a different type of person. And so we have the fortune, I think, and the benefit of knowing that in any environment we're going to get hundreds of thousands of applicants. What we have to challenge ourselves on is the skill gap of understanding from those that are hiring the importance of having a broad group of skill sets coming into the organization. So are we just looking for someone who is a finance major who has taken all the courses and had all the internships? In some ways you might say, well, that would be the straightest line from A to B. But in reality, what we've seen in the history of the firm is that we need that broad base. And so our job is to make sure that people understand the breadth of the skills that people need to have when they come in and could do very well at the firm.
Interesting. And in a little bit, I want to talk about what you guys are doing at Goldman to then train after people are hired,
Sure.
Out of these top schools. One of the things that is fascinating when I'm able to sit and listen and speak with executives at companies, really that span different industries around the world is, sort of the next generation of talent that's coming in. And, you've heard, some comments around, the AT&T workforce, which is there, and they're having to evolve and compete with different kinds of companies like a Google or an Amazon. Generally, people think of younger kids coming out of schools that are working in coding and engineering and different areas. But maybe talk to us a little bit about just your perspective. I want to get your thoughts on, do we have a skills gap? And then two, can the millennials fix that?
Yeah, so I should say I kind of have multiple hats here. One, I am a millennial. I guess I'm the resident millennial on the panel. And two, I employ.
I think that was a shot.
I employ and hire.
Making an assumption there, man. I don't know.
Employ and hire millennials for the company that I run, and I've spent a fair amount of time really looking at this issue, and also on the political side, we can hopefully get into more later, the policy challenges around this stuff is a lot of the work that I do on the company side. But so I guess I would say two things. One, I think that there is a understanding gap about that is perhaps more pronounced than the skills gap. I think, as I've seen in companies, whether they're big or whether they're small, we have a mantra which is, hire for attitude, train for skill. And now that's not always possible in a lot of roles that require a very specific skill set. But I think, despite all that we know about engineering and the rise of those roles, I actually think there's more of a need for people to come in with an attitude and a perspective than there actually is a skills gap. And I actually think it's one of the assets that this generation has, is it's a generation that can learn something new very quickly and is excited to do that and particularly likes the idea of a challenge. One of the misnomers about millennials, people talk about millennials being job hoppers, and the average millennial will have 12 different jobs by the time they turn 33, 34.
Or they want to work from home,
right?
or different.
But I think that some people interpret that as about entitlement or disloyalty. It's actually about people wanting to move on to a new challenge because they've topped out here. They want something new because we've shifted into a place where long gone are the days where people said, well, that's my job, and that happens from 9 to 5, and then I go home, and then that's my life. I think that is to the degree that has been breaking down for this generation, that totally doesn't exist anymore. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has their to some degree it's part of their identity and part of their life. So what we're seeking out of it is something much more. And I think some employers understand that. and other employers don't. Some people hear it, and other people choose. At a place, I'm sure Edith can speak to this. At a place like Goldman Sachs, and particularly given political views of people in this generation, you have there's a need to make people feel like am I coming here just to make lots of money, or is there something? What's the value? How am I going to be helping? Am I going to be doing something positive here? And all of that I think plays into this. So I think the question, can millennials fix it? I think that I describe myself as someone who is pro-reality, which is, I think, a viewpoint that not always
Which is different than the reality distortion field.
But
Democrat.
But I think that one of the things we have to understand is this is the workforce, right? This is what's coming, right? And so whether millennials are going to fix it or not fix it, this is the deck of cards that we're dealt presents tremendous opportunity. I believe that this generation can be one of the largest, most valuable, hardest working groups of people, and they are, but it's not when you slot them into the way that people have always done business. If you do that, you don't get the most out of people in this generation, and it produces a lot of the stereotypes that people have.
Very interesting. And in a minute, I want to ask, sort of give you this up front, but I want to try to understand if companies and employers understand how to hire millennials, right? Because I've talked to some that are still sort of, wow, this next generation is clearly very different that's coming up, and do they need to learn how to hire this?
Can I just add one thing? I'm eager to hear what Jared has to say. This just reminded me of something which I think is worth pointing out, because I think the other thing about this mentality, I think it actually is transcending and affecting people of all generations. I was with last week a friend of mine who was she's in her late 30s. She was CEO of a big brand that a lot of you have probably heard of. And someone like her, she had a bunch of EVP of global marketing, and sort of she was on a track. Someone like her, 20 years ago, her path was to become CEO of a publicly traded company, and that was the path she was on at this particular place. And then she kind of woke up one day as she was spending time with all the younger people she was working with, and saying, "I want to start my own thing." Maybe that's not for me anymore. So I think that there's a big effect that this mentality is having on people who traditionally moved up the chain, who were older as well. So I just wanted to mention that.
That's interesting. I'd really, Jared, like to get your view on from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You hear terms of this is costing, whether it's the skills gap or the issues that John outlined at AT&T. You hear that it's costing the economy hundreds of billions of dollars, right? I've read that, different figures, and they're in different contexts, but this is a very expensive problem. Just in its simplest form, if companies, and again, we have some different perspective of whether, and how big the skills gap is, but what I read is it's about 5 million jobs and I don't care whether they're welders or scientists, right? It's if companies and employers are trying to hire people and they can't, for whatever reason, get them, that is a very expensive issue that we have to deal with in terms of how it impacts our GDP. Can you give some color around that?
Sure. I too am a millennial. I dye my hair and insert all these wrinkles so people will take me more seriously. So it's good to be here with fellow millennials.
I just pulled mine out.
I think that those kinds of numbers are probably overblown. However, the nuances that have come up already in the discussion seem to me true and important. So in defense of Seth's point, if there was really, at least the way an economist would think about this at first blush, I'll give you a second blush in a second, is if there was really a pressing skill shortage of the type that has been described and that you read about all the time, and the type that you can't talk to an employer for 5 minutes without hearing about, there would have to be more pressure, more upward pressure on the wages of more skilled or more highly educated workers relative to those with less skill.
Interesting point.
And you don't see it. And now, you saw a lot of that in the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s, but in fact the differential between high and, quote, low-skilled workers, at least as proxied by education, has actually been pretty flat. By the way, it's at an historical high, so if you're listening to me, go to college if you haven't, go to grad school if you haven't. I see a lot of people here already did that probably, or it's too late for you if you haven't.
I vote for that too. Please go back to school.
But so that premium is high, but it's not growing. And it's a head scratcher as to why, if the situation John described is operative, that you don't see more pressure on wages. You don't see firms offering more in a systematic way. AT&T may be different, and John can tell us about that. So here's the second blush. I have a friend who works in Silicon Valley and goes through this all the time, and I argue about this with him, and he tells me, you're looking at the wrong variable. It's not rates of change, it's levels. We don't have to raise pay of our employees to get good employees, because when they come here, or maybe when they go to Goldman or some other places, the amount that they're getting paid is so much higher than anybody else's that they're really happy about it, and we're meeting any of our skill demands with a relative pay rate that's so much higher than what's available to people in other parts of the industry, that we get the workers we need. Now, economists tend to think in terms of derivatives. If the skills gap is persistent and growing, then we should see that differential growing. We don't. So it's a bit of a head scratcher, at least in terms of first derivatives, and perhaps in levels you could make the argument. I'm skeptical. I'm closer to Seth only in the following sense. I've talked to employers literally for 40 years about this, and I've never heard them say, we're not suffering from a huge skills gap. And that just seems like kind of a mantra at this point. Let me just say one other thing and then turn the conversation back.
And if any of the panelists want to jump in at any point in time, please do so.
So I think we make a bit of a mistake, although we're catering to an audience, correctly I would argue, catering to an audience here and at the conference. It's very much focused on the very top of the pay scale and the skill scale. If I asked you, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics makes occupational projections 10 years in advance, and they actually have a pretty good track record of figuring out where the jobs are going to be 10 years hence in terms of the occupational distribution. They make mistakes. A bunch of years ago, they saw that a lot of people were getting older, and they thought, oh, we're going to need more travel agents because older people travel more. They didn't foresee Expedia and such, and so they were wrong about that. But generally, if you actually line up what they think is going to happen with what happened, they're pretty close. So the 10 occupations adding the most jobs over the next 10 years, if I asked this crowd what you think they are, I'll bet you wouldn't say that 6, 7 of the top 10 are absolutely in the lowest quartile. They are retail clerks. They're healthcare aides, they're childcare workers, which, by the way, to me should be a skilled profession, but unfortunately is often not. They are people who drive trucks. Now, some of them are, systems analysts up there, but most of the jobs, secondary teachers in schools, most of the jobs there are what you might consider low skill. I don't love the terminology because there's actually a lot to being a skilled healthcare worker. However, that is another place, and I think a very important place to think about the evolution of the workforce of tomorrow. Even if we're talking about the freelance economy, the gap economy, the Uber economy, the 1099, a lot of those jobs are not systems analysts who are trying to figure out how to compete with Google in the communications sector. A lot of those jobs are for people who we have to worry about, their skill levels in terms of a home health aide who has a community college degree in gerontology is going to do better than one who doesn't, but also in terms of the quality of their jobs. And that's an issue I know Seth has thought about as well.
Mike Milken has the best, and I know he works with the Institute, he has the best statistics on education and training, and one of them that I read was emerging economies are going to produce 16 million STEM graduates annually, nearly 5 times more than the 3.3 million from developed countries. So, you talked about these other jobs, but you have to admit, what we hear about is we need STEM, we need STEM, we need STEM.
Let me tell you one factoid about that.
Not truck drivers.
So, then I don't want to say, there was a couple of recent studies and found that there are a lot of STEM workers who are underemployed, who find themselves in non-STEM fields. So it's not even clear that we need certainly cream of the crop STEM workers, no question, but churning out STEM workers is not an obvious goal when you look at the data.
By the way, one interesting statistic, by far, and we own schools on 6 continents, when college students hit math, drop rates spike. Across the nation, across the world. It's an issue that still needs to be dealt with. Seth, I do want to ask you, give us a look into the Labor Department. So the government would look at this issue that we're talking about. What are they doing about it?
We do spend a tremendous amount of time talking about it, not as much as folks in the business world do. the dialogue between business and government on this, I think, has been interesting, but not necessarily as productive as we have needed it to be. I actually very much related to your comment about millennials and where they fit in organizations, having run a large government enterprise, very large government enterprise.
How many people are in the department?
There are 17,000 employees. It's about an $85 billion enterprise, and with 23 operating units, very complicated organization. And with love and respect for my former colleagues, and including myself in this mix, a really old organization, right? Something that you were just talking about, John. And so the idea of hiring millennials with all the experiences that they have had, not merely with technology, but with the way organizations work, with the way learning works, and putting them in a really traditional 20th century, some would argue 19th century organization that's deeply hierarchical, where the career ladders stretch over decades, not over months or years. It's really an open question whether hiring folks into that environment means that we're putting them on a path to success. The single most important thing that the Labor Department was able to do, I think, under President Obama was to fund something called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Act, which put $2 billion into community colleges over a 4-year period. And we essentially required community colleges to compete by going out and finding employers like AT&T, and in Charlotte, Siemens was one of the partners. There are a number of others all around the country, to engage a dialogue with employers where the employers would say, here's what we need, here is our growth path. Here, as we come together as an industry, are the sets of skills that we need to have. I actually traveled to Green Bay, Wisconsin, which you may not know is the luxury boat building capital of the world, not just the United States. I was very surprised by that too. And the community college organized the luxury boat building industry, most of which are fairly small businesses, to have a dialogue about what jobs they needed, what skills they needed, what their growth path was, where they could do common training at the community college, where they had specialized skills, where it was better done in-house. And they've helped that industry to grow with this seed money that the Labor Department was able to provide through the TACT program. And that was recreated all across the United States. So that kind of partnership where skills drives economic development and where employers find the skilled workers they need by growing them in partnership with academic institutions can be done. But that was actually, even though $2 billion sounds like a lot of money, although maybe not at this conference,
That's one guy in the hallway.
It actually is, that's right. I'd like to meet that guy. I've got an idea for a company. But we actually were able to fund programs that train maybe a few tens of thousands of workers, maybe a couple 100,000 workers, when the demand is much, much greater. The bulk of the money in this space doesn't come from government, although it's supported by tax breaks. It comes from business. I mean, business is spending the money to train their workers. And the question is, how are you spending it and who are you targeting it at?
It's really interesting. And by the way, your comment, I think, was very important, not so much about the luxury boat capital of the world. They also have a little football team up there, I know, that we despise in Chicago. But it's hard to get it out of your system. It really is hard to get it out of your system. First Favre and then Rodgers, and it just gets worse and worse. But, I think that's one of the things that I've learned, again, with our institutions around the world. Listening first, having that conversation. And I want to put up the slide for John, please, because I want John to explain a couple things for us next. But, as an example, I went into AT&T and asked, their CEO and head of HR and some other folks, what do you need and what are you doing? And what I find, what institutions tend to do, I'm just talking about the educational piece, whether it's short-term, long-term, whether you're building skills or, stackable certificates, whatever it is. We build a bunch of stuff and then we say this is right for you, instead of coming and saying, what do you need us to build, right? And that's one of the things that I think institutions are. Some are doing a better job of now in the U.S. are listening to businesses. We need to do it better, but I know for a fact that some of the things I've seen in AT&T. Now you ask, okay, well, how do you fix this? What are some of the things you can do now to solve these issues? And I wonder, John, if you could talk more specific about the things that you're doing at AT&T.
Sure, sure. I don't think the audience will benefit as much if we group things. So I'm going to challenge some of the things that have been said by the panel. And, you know, like, for instance, The Economist, the economics of today's labor force are not measured properly. I think that it's just bunk that you can look at it and say, okay, well, it's going to bubble up into pressure. You look at things like the gig economy. You look at how productivity is measured today fundamentally with the advancements of tools and apps and people with mobile phones and how they work and where they work. And then, importantly, the wages aren't anymore viewed the same way they used to be. I mean, people value, for us, it was a big, you know, collective shout of applause when we said we're going to give people paid time to go do community service work. And so all of a sudden, what is compensation has changed dramatically. And that's true of
the value proposition you're speaking
right.
to.
And so millennials have come in and lit a match. And they lit a match that started a fire that's burning wider than that, because they're changing how people come to work and address things, and folks that have been around a couple of decades. So I actually think with millennials as well, we sell them on the project, but it dehumanizes to put them in this view that they behave a certain way and they're going to do certain things. They come for the project, and you know what? They stay for the people. And that's the same human thing that's been around for you know, 100 years. I mean, people want to work with people they love. And the bigger the company, the better, because now they can come and stay in the same parking space and switch jobs. So they can kind of routinize their days and fall in love with the people and then have this diversity of jobs. And so I just challenge us as we think about this to get one layer below the big level statistics, because I think the mathematics of how you manage people is changing in a really fundamental way. And I think the technology overlay is causing how we have viewed the world for a long time and measured it to just get blown up. And so we use big data in ways that are remarkable to look at people's schedules and their calendars and who connects with whom and how decisions are getting made. And sometimes we say things like, we're not going to throw more experience at a problem, we're going to throw less experience at a problem. Let's get a brand new person and a pile of data and see what they can figure out. Because maybe people that have been around forever are just looking at it a certain way. So I did bring one slide because I want to kind of underscore the evolution from philosophy to action. If you look at, you know, there are enough things out there today that most organizations can go jump in and do things. So we had 256 jobs types in technology in our company. We said that's not wide enough because you can't just have a job, you have to have a future. So we defined something called a role, which is wider than a job. It's the job you have now, and then widening that over time so that you can progress. 96 roles. We set up a curriculum so that everybody knew how they could go from here to there. We partnered what's there, we call it reskilling. We're careful not to call it training. Training feels like, you know, you do compliance training, you check the box. The reskilling is a competency. You have to re-earn your way in, you have to get graded, you have to pass. And it's not just pass-fail, you get grades. We did consortiums with Georgia Tech, OU, there's 35 total companies, and then we created a whole range of activities from, I can earn a badge, which says I'm familiar. I can earn a nano degree. What a nano degree is says if I have an undergrad in engineering, it's a pretty good start. I can be a cybersecurity analyst, or I can be a big data scientist by just appending the parts that weren't there in my education. We called those nano degrees. We partnered with Udacity to build them in the areas that we needed. And some of the numbers are up there. We have 1.8 million courses completed. And that's from about 120,000 employees that have registered. And then we have 114,000 badges. And now we're starting every quarter to pump out people that are 30 years with the company who went back and got a nano degree. And I'm going to tell you through the eyes of an employee, because I really want to, for this audience, humanize these things that are programs and measurements. I was on the elevator one day, and a woman had the biggest smile I'd ever seen, and I asked her why she was so happy. And she said, because today I finished my first course on a path to a nano degree. What are you studying? Big data. She said, I give myself a birthday gift every year, and I used to buy jewelry or shoes or something. This year I'm giving myself a nano degree for my birthday. And I said, why did you choose to do that? Her answer stunned me, because I thought she was going to say to future-proof my skills and so on and so forth. She said to inspire my children. Because if they can see me at my age go back and stay at school, that go back and reskill myself, then they'll realize that they can do that at every refresh cycle.
Can I just one follow on? Can you, so when that happens, and I know what you're talking about, getting to go to a graduation from time to time. You know, I had a woman look at me, and I asked her why she decided to go back and pursue her degree, and she said, and what was the best thing about it? She said, my kids look at me differently now. Like, it was just such an amazing answer to hear. Retention of your employees, right? Huge issue if you're just churning employees.
Yeah.
Can you see that? I mean, is that actually, you know, so I think about how your employees must feel that you're making an investment in that. Is that actually leading to better retention of employees?
There are portions of our business which have high turnover because of the nature of the role. They're transitional in nature. So, you know, we have retail numbers, but we're better than that. We have customer care centers, but we're better than that. When you take the management jobs, in particular like in technology, our turnover, I would actually describe it as negligible. You know what I mean? Barely able to measure it. Because people are just, you know,
And are most people who go into those jobs starting with the company right out of university, or are they lateral? What is the
So, some of
path
both.
to
Today
management?
we have a program. We in total we hire tens of thousands of people every year. But if you get into the STEM disciplines, you know, we're going to hire somewhere around 6,000. Probably 4,000 of those will be out of school. But we're one of those companies that, you know, I love my boss because Randall will stick with things that are hard to do. And so you get in a downturn, we invest. Every year, no matter where the economy is, we hire internships in hundreds and hundreds. So the schools know we're going to be back. The kids know we're going to be there. And so what that tends to do is it provides us an opportunity that we start to develop a reputation with the professors at the school. So we get a couple thousand a year out of schools. And we have really very, very little turnover. I think that my own view of the workforce of today is I think millennials are underappreciated for the courage they have to kind of come in and shake up a workplace. And then if you get the other conditions right, to points that were made earlier, the challenge, the ability to give back to society, they stay.
Yeah.
They don't want to run to another job. They want to run to another challenge.
Yeah, anybody ever gets a chance to hear Randall Stephenson speak, he's the CEO of AT&T, one of the best CEOs, I think, on the planet. I truly
would say
mean
the
that.
best, but I'm biased.
There's another one here, too, if you get a chance to hear Eric Spiegel, who runs Siemens, doing some incredibly enterprising things with apprenticeship programs that I think are amazing. Can Goldman Sachs differentiate itself by the talent that they, I mean, is there enough where you think it's pretty viciously competitive on Wall Street? Can you differentiate yourselves? It seems like Goldman, I hate to admit this, coming from Credit Suisse, but there's a cachet about Goldman, right? And you know, it's sort of the best of the best, right? The upper echelon. I'm not trying to put down the other banks, but do they get better people?
First of all, it sounds great when you say we're upper echelons, we get the best of the best. When we started believing that that's a given, our 145-year future will not be as interesting as our 145-year past. You know, we just cannot take that for granted. Because when you listen to us describe the type of individual we're looking for someone who can fit and thrive in our culture. And our culture has words like judgment, integrity, teamwork, diversity, which I'm going to come back to in a second. Yeah. And I would suspect if we were to look at the cultures of the organizations that you're currently involved in or have been, the words are not that different. Yeah. And so the goal of Goldman Sachs is to be a people business, but more importantly, we are a human capital business with the key being human. We have, throughout the years, spent an extraordinary amount of time taking a look at our people's experiences. Like I'm sure many of you, we ask questions, we do people surveys, we got all this participation, et cetera, And more recently, and we focus on consistently, how do we really create a workforce globally that's a reflection of the countries and communities that we operate in. The conversation around generational differences, i.e. millennials, is something that I personally started to try to get under the hood of, 3 or 4 years ago. As a result of the fact that there was that noise of, oh my gosh, this is just, a generation that comes and goes. I got coffee, I put in the time, what's up with these young people, so to speak. Do you know that 60% of our firm are in that 22 to 35 demographic? 60% of the firm. Let's just say our leadership structure does not reflect that demographic.
Our investment banks, I've been out for 9 years, so are they a lot more inclusive than they were a decade ago, diverse, maybe than 10 years ago? Frank Luntz talked yesterday, it was a great session about inclusion and diversity and how millennials are also changing that very importantly, throughout the...
I have to say we have to be, but I'd also have to say that we work hard at it. Generational difference, millennials is a big part of that. But goodness knows we and almost every other organization out there has a tremendous amount of work to do. And I can use the millennial conversation. I'm struggling on using that word because I'm getting the feedback now that people don't want to be called millennials because it's, again, another way of typecasting and branding people, which is by definition offensive, which I can appreciate. So maybe we can kind of get ideas on what we should call it instead. But the reality is, as I was looking at the people opportunities in the next 3, 5, 10 years, it was pretty clear that I, with many of my colleagues at the firm, needed to get smart, right? We need to get smart about things that are important, not important, critical to the way that people coming into the workforce today think and interact, right? I mean, how could we be relevant to the thousands of people that we like to attract the firm if we aren't conversant in the basics of social media? I'm talking basic stuff. I'm not talking about the advanced things. I mean, one day will use my Uber app and I'll feel really special. But something, that's not special. That's like basic functioning. Yeah. And I just found that there was a gap between the capabilities, often driven by technology, of the people that were coming into the workforce and those of us who were stewards of the culture. So what have we done about that? It's the same thing that's been critical as we've really hold ourselves accountable for the diversity broadly defined conversation, which is the real conversation, right? It's not about us sitting in a room and deciding that based upon the experts. It's really about connecting human to human. It's extraordinary. I agree with your point, which is, people connect to organizations through people. We do an extraordinary amount of hard work to make sure that we've got learning opportunities because we know people want to learn. We do a tremendous amount of getting under the hood around things that influence the human dynamic. Unconscious bias is something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. So we've got to make sure that the environment is conducive to creating the collective from individual experiences, because we don't hire people as masses. We don't go and say, okay, we want to hire you 50 people all at once. We go through an extraordinary efforts to interview each person over and over again. We do all this analysis to understand, and then people come through the door and you're like, okay, get on the train and help us do things the way we've always done it. It's not feasible anymore, and it's not appropriate. And
if you don't, I'm sorry, go.
And so the punchline here is that I think the most important thing is to create a level of conversation and dialogue that broadens the understanding and empathy, and I'm choosing empathy, of someone else's experience. That's what moves from the individual to the collective, and so often what it comes down to is conversation and dialogue, right? You have to talk to people. It is the technology era, but quite frankly, the thing that is always exciting and also fascinating is that, people want to connect with other people throughout the organization. And if you don't figure out a way to do that, and if you don't figure out a way to get people to understand how what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is part of the overall objective, they're not going to stay. They're just not going to. And that doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Yeah, and when you talk about the age of the technology, I just real quickly want to highlight the fact that every job is getting more technical. So if you work in a call center, you don't look through the yellow pages and get an 800 number and call. They've tried to self-service. They're already ticked off. They want to start with where they left off. They want you to see into their systems. That's your starting point. And the technician goes out to the home and they say, my broadband is slow, my internet is slow. Well, it might be the operating system, it might be the wiring. Every job has sort of had to elevate its requirements technologically to just be there and survive. And from our own perspective, the way we think about it is that those who aren't making that leap are just retiring into extinction. And that's what I think sometimes doesn't show up in the numbers yet, is the nature of the jobs are causing this rotation within the economy. And like you said, you can't just simply know how to press an app. Like that's the starting point.
But it's important for it to develop on both sides of the equation. Please, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You know, it's and you made the point earlier that there's a lot of opportunity when you have these cultural generational shifts. I don't know as a firm how Goldman Sachs would continue to be relevant if we didn't have our minds wide open to understanding the behavior of 60% of the firm, but a growing percentage of the population. You know, our research folks have done some really interesting work on understanding how consumer behavior is very much being transformed by the behaviors of, you know, the demographic that represents. And if we don't understand that in our day-to-day existence, but also learn, right, from the people coming into the workforce, you know, we're gonna, you know, the mighty Goldman Sachs, we have to be doing that to continue to be relevant.
Can I jump in here? I think we are at risk of spending disproportionate time on our panel on a very narrow and in fact very impressive slice of the workforce of the future. If you see the lens through the kind of model employers that we have represented down here, and I say that high praise with great appreciation for what you do, you're actually going to miss the bigger picture. You can't wave your hands and just say these wage trends don't mean anything, they're not measured accurately, or productivity is inaccurately measured. A, I don't think that's correct, and B, stagnant wages of middle-class workers and even entry-level college-educated workers. If you look at the wage trends of people freshly out of college, they've been flat for a while in real terms. That's a real problem. Now, that's not the kind of people that are being hired at AT&T and Goldman, and I understand that. But solving the problem of the workforce of tomorrow and investing in that workforce is going to mean thinking well beyond the top few percent. It's going to mean trying to figure out how we improve the quality of jobs in a sector of the economy that is growing quickly, Seth knows about this, that is at an increasingly arm's length from their employer. So we're talking about independent contractors who are part of the gig economy. They're not going to get the kind of benefits that the AT&T and Goldman are talking about down there, and that's according to some measures, that's a very significant share of the workforce. I mentioned, you know, home health aides. It's not the case that child care workers and home health aides and teachers' assistants are massively changed by technology the way they are in your sectors. There are technological changes, but at the end of the day, it's a woman, usually a woman, in a room with an old person on Medicaid, or in a room with 30 kids trying to provide some childhood education, and that's a large and growing and important part of the workforce, and it's not the Cadillac slice that we've been focused on.
Can I just comment on that for a second, because I think that one of the work I do is very much geared around how do we basically address this question with a new generation of policymakers and people who are actually living in the world in which these things are real. And I think that part of the challenge is that until something becomes part of what you see every day, it becomes very difficult, I think, as this kind of conversation reflects, to see how much a part of that is. I was stunned to learn and this reflects my own cultural bias that a couple years ago that one of the number one occupations, and maybe Jared, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, maybe I was misinformed, in the United States of males without a college degree is something that involves driving a car, is truck driver, et cetera, right? And when you mention these sort of all the things you just mentioned to the earlier example about Expedia and travel agents that was mentioned, all of them are things that are, or the 6 you mentioned, are severely potentially impacted by automation. So when and what's ahead. So there may very well be a moment in time where Google's self-driving cars come along and we say, oh my God, that was so crazy that we ever let humans drive cars. Why on earth did we do that? But at the same time, where does that leave us on these other questions? And I think that the same can be said about all these kinds of things. Where is the as someone who has been at various different points, an independent contractor, doing various gigs and things like that, the law is not written to favor independent contractors at all. And we did not foresee necessarily that becoming such a large part of this. Policymakers don't understand that. There's obviously a new generation of economists that I'm sure are just kind of beginning to really dig into these questions. But it represents a huge piece of where we're going, and these are I think some of the really fundamental questions, which are I think different than questions about hiring, right? Which I think are also important and complex. But
Exactly.
where is our country going? If we're not able, you think that could we actually hit a place to where we're at 50% unemployment? I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but I'm just saying if you look at sort of the impact of sort of what could happen to all these, if we don't do something about it, if we aren't able to see in advance what's happening to these jobs, when you hear people who run fast food chains say, well, I would love to just put in a terminal because it could go and it could spit out the food, it could take your order, there'd be no errors, there'd be no employee theft. When you look,
Not a great metaphor,
right?
but keep going.
But I think that's. I mean, someone said this the other day, right? And I think that you look at again industry after industry, and I think it takes part of what it does is if the premium is on efficiency and productivity, as we seem to be moving more and more towards. If the 20th century was about creating lots of stuff, the 21st century is in large part about how do we deal with what we've built and how do we get it to be better and sort of down to this point. I think it takes out the idea of humanity. I think it takes out, right? That from it. I don't think it's. I mean, maybe a more productive world. It's not a world I'm particularly excited to live in, to be perfectly honest. Where I have to interact with as few people as possible. I love the potential, good things that could come with AI, and there's a lot of conversation
We're going to
about
have this
that.
panel with
but-
Oculus headsets in a few years, and you're all going to be in
But
your
I think,
homes.
but I think to Jared's point, we have to be really serious about the concerns that this presents, and I think it's one thing to say, these apps, these apps are our economy, I mean, and they are becoming that more and more so.
Let me ask quickly, does anybody want to ask a question from the audience? We have a great panel and a great variety up here. So we have a microphone. We've got one in the back here, and then we'll come here.
Hi, I'm John Scully.
John.
I just wanted to drill down on the shift in work from my generation, which sort of work as being in silos of departments and functions, to the work today in large enterprises, not just startups, which is all organized around projects. And projects have great tools. You can see Slack, for example, is a $4 billion valued company. It's only 3 years old. Gives collaboration capabilities. How do you think about the combination of these independent contractors that Jared, you mentioned? How do you think of them in terms of, many of them have high skills. They like the flexibility of a lifestyle that enables them to live and plan a career differently. And more I see, I'm in this part of the business, how do you see the permanence in an organization that are being brought on to project teams, often at very large scales? Companies like HP and IBM are hiring tens of thousands of these highly skilled independent contractors, putting together on project teams with permanent employees in order to get there faster with more urgency on particularly new skills that they may not have in their organizations. Do you see that as a real part of the way you think about the new American workforce?
So I know you asked that question of Jared, but I wonder if
No,
I
no,
can pick
I-
up
yeah,
on it,
you-
and then
I
I'll
want
Sure,
you to-
Seth, please.
I was going to
Jared,
kick it to Seth anyway.
I'll answer, and then Jared will clean it up.
I'm not.
A very important study was just released that showed that there has been an increase of 50% over the last decade in alternative work arrangements. The last time the Labor Department did a study was in 2005. It showed about 10%. This new study, which recreated the government study because the Labor Department has not done it in that time because Congress won't pay for it, showed that it was better than 15% in alternative work arrangements. That's independent contractors, it's contract workers, it's temporary help workers, it's on-demand workers. The largest growth has not been among independent contractors, although there has been meaningful growth in that sector. The largest growth has been among temporary help workers and contract workers. The contract workers are the kind of high-skilled workers that you're describing. So that's a phenomenon. We don't have to say it's good or bad. We just have to acknowledge that it is true and then ask ourselves, what does it mean for skills development in our country? So when you're affiliated with an organization like AT&T or Goldman Sachs, your employer has a meaningful incentive to ensure that you have the requisite skills not merely to be productive in your current job, but to potentially move to other jobs, to work on projects with coworkers, to maybe sand off the rough edges if you're not so great at working in teams. You know, they have a meaningful incentive to do that. If you're an independent contractor out on your own, who's going to do that for you? Whose job is it to get you those skills? Well, it's really yours. Even if you're a temporary help worker. You know, that Kelly and Manpower are not investing in training those workers because they don't necessarily know what their customers are going to want at any given time. They may, and they may train you in that direction, but really it is delegated to the individual to get the skills that they need in order to make themselves marketable in this high-speed labor market that they're finding themselves in. So whose job is it to make sure that that happens? Well, you'd expect government to jump in that experience, and you'd expect government to provide excellent K through 12 training. You'd expect them to provide flexible skills training that includes degrees, college degrees, two-year and four-year degrees, master's degrees, credentials of varying kinds, because there isn't anybody else to do it. But the individual is funding it for themselves. And that's where the big challenge comes in, is that a lot of folks who don't necessarily have meaningful economic security, they can't rely on a paycheck week to week, month to month, with a retirement plan as you're going to get at terrific companies like these, right? They have to figure out where the resources are going to come from. So we're putting a lot more pressure in this space, in the skills development space, on individuals, just as we are, let me just say, in the health space, in the retirement space, in a lot of other areas where before workers didn't have the risk because they could always fall back on their employer. Their employer was going to provide it to them. So I think your point about project-based work is a terrific development. It breaks down silos. It means that you're putting skills to work in the right places. You're matching skills needs to competency, individual competencies. An excellent development in corporate America, I think. But to the extent that you're going outside the organization and you're renting your labor rather than hiring, employing, and investing in your labor, boy, that's presenting our society with a really, truly meaningful challenge. And we're leaving those individual workers in a little bit of a tough spot because they've got to come up with the financing for all of this stuff themselves.
You meant one more quick one in the front here. I know you had a question. Mike, great question, by the way.
Firstly, I want to congratulate the panel. Serena Rosso is my name. I'm from Australia, and I have 1,200 staff in Australia and the UK. Two parts, the educational arm, higher education, and the other part is welfare to work. We've expanded enormously in the last 20 months. And one of the biggest challenges for me over the last 37 years is this extraordinary expansion. But my challenge is that management for us, you know, the only time we get rid of them is when we liberate them, so they can stay with us for 10, 12, 15 years. But with the ground level of operations, where we have something like, in the industry, 52% turnover. We do welfare to work. We have clients who are aggressive. We have clients who come in who have addiction, homeless. You know, you name them and we have them. And what we find is that we can't keep our staff on the ground level. We've, you know, given them incentives. We've given them bonuses. You know, we love them. You know, we go and visit them. We acknowledge them. 52% in this industry. My question is, what advice do you give? I mean, you know, Goldman Sachs, everyone wants to work there, but welfare to work, it's another different part of the game. Can you give us some advice on, you know, how do you incentivize people who are dealing with aggressive clients or
Where's the turnover?
challenging
I'm
clients?
Sorry. So the turnover is people working with the individuals who are moving from welfare to work, or is it people who are coming from welfare to work and they leave? Where's the turnover?
Oh no,
question?
our staff,
Your
our
staff
industry,
who works,
our industry,
okay,
who work
understood.
for us. We, you know, we have the mature set, the young set. We've got diversity, but you know, it's the clients that are really difficult, and they, you know, they say they want to. Our staff, it's an industry problem.
We're getting the hook here, so I'm gonna ask one of you to answer that question.
I want to first thank you for what you do.
Oh, thank you.
Doing something for those folks
I love
it's a degree harder than everything you do.
Thank you.
I think that it's true of anything that's on the front line. I think that you have to instructively and constructively inspire people to inspire others. It's really hard, and it requires an incessant, maniacal focus on making sure that inspiration arrives every day. And that's tricky to get. But thank you so much for what you
I
do.
agree
That's
with that.
amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll never give up, by the way. I love my job.
I'll end with this. This is what I know for sure, which is education is power. And when you provide individuals with education, whether it's short-term or long-term, they have more options available to them, whether it's here or anywhere in the world. So thank you so much. What a great panel. I really enjoy the answers, and
Thank you.
thank you for being here.